When I write my articles, I want to put into those articles the challenges that they had as blind people. Even when I try and massage the names to see if I can't make them come up in some other way, they just fall off the face of the earth. In many communities, it was frowned upon for two blind people to marry because you would only be continuing your blindness. How could you be parents anyway?
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson. When you read the title, The Blind History Lady, it's probably a lady writing about history, about the blind. That's exactly right. Our guest today, Peggy Chong, is also an author, a columnist, and a genealogist. She has a series on the web called The Blind History Lady Presents, and you can find that at smashwords.com. She also does a quarterly column for a magazine called Dialogue Magazine, and her column is titled The Way We Were. It was many years since Peggy Chong was in Minnesota, and it was nice to get in touch with her. She's now in New Mexico, and it was a pleasure to talk about her writings, the people in history that she has scraped up some of the neatest little articles about and put stories together about people who may have just been lost in history. But thanks to Peggy Chong and her initiative, she has restored their lives for others to listen to share, and to learn from. We hope you like this story. And if you want to find more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and check out our Blind Abilities app from the App Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities. So without further ado, please welcome the blind history lady, Peggy Chong.
Hello.
Hello, Peggy Chong?
Yes, I'm here.
Gotcha. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
That's good. So you're in New Mexico now?
I am indeed. Yes, the land of enchantment.
Oh, nice. The land of enchantment. So, Peggy, can you tell our listeners how you became the blind history lady?
It's kind of funny because I was never very good in school, and history was just very difficult for me. But when history started applying to me, when I had a chance to be a part of something or had a connection, it meant a lot more. Then in the early 80s, I was given a task of cleaning out all these old files. I grew up in the blind community. I knew a lot of blind people who were working blind people. They maybe were not rich, but they supported themselves and they were energetic. They were contributing to their communities. So I was given the task to clean out these files because I would probably know more of the people in the old files. And as I was going through the files, I would just read a thing or two here and there, and I ran across a reference to our blind U.S. congressman. And I thought to myself, blind U.S. congressman? How come I never heard of a blind U.S. congressman? And checked him out, and it was the blind congressman from Minnesota, Thomas David Shaw, who later went on to be a U.S. senator from Minnesota. I just had to know more about him. So I started to, here and there, collect data, ask questions, and going through those files, I ran across some other names, so I put them aside.
So just set them aside. So it must have sparked an interest. And so when did you start to dig these back up again?
Over the years, I have been collecting a variety of data on blind people, jobs that blind people have done. And about 5 years ago, after I had gotten stumped a little on family genealogy, because I'd become a genealogist, I decided to take out some of those files, use the skills that I had learned as a genealogist to go and find those people, and have been able to track down ancestors of some of these blind people, grandchildren, great nieces, great nephews, who have still saved information regarding their blind ancestor. And they have been very willing to share with me. So I have been able to put together some really wonderful stories about blind people who have done extraordinary things and who have been just your average citizen in the communities, but the extraordinary efforts that they had to get to in order to become that. We often hear, and you often read, they overcame their blindness.
Overcoming your blindness. So in a century's time, things really haven't changed.
Through my research, I have begun to wonder, is it our blindness that we've overcome, or is it the fears, worries, and misconceptions of everybody else?
That's a good point.
For example, there was a man by the name of Leland in Iowa who was very smart, went to the university, got a teaching certificate. The school, the university, helped a lot of their students get jobs, but not him. The school district said, and we're talking back in the turn of the 20th century, so we're not talking very big buildings here. But they were telling him, well, I don't know how you get around our school building. So for a few years, what he did was he walked the country roads selling typewriters door to door. Now, that's a lot more territory to cover than a small school building, and he did it successfully. He was able to earn enough money where he actually bought his own music store. If he couldn't be a teacher, then he would fall back on what he knew, which was music. He had a large enough store where blind musicians could perform. He would sometimes give them free space to do so, to help launch their careers. So he overcame his blindness by going much, much further than any other teacher at that school had to go, just in order to open his own business.
Peggy, I was reading some of your work on smashwords.com, and now I believe you also write for a newspaper?
I also am a columnist for Dialogue magazine. I write the history column, and I have an article in Dialogue every quarter that highlights some of these blind people.
I do have to say, I love the name of your column.
It's kind of a nice title, The Way We Were.
The Way We Were.
And it highlights, in my articles, I try to highlight the techniques that I find that these blind people use. When I write my articles, I want to put into those articles the challenges that they had as blind people. For example, getting someone to let them student teach. Maybe they had to work for free for a while. Or they hired, and this is especially common in the 1800s and early 1900s, they would hire young children to act as their travel guide. And what did that mean? Piano tuners who went door to door to promote their craft often had a child or a person with them as their guide. But if that guide talked, it negated the perception of a quality piano tuner. So there were actually some guidelines that blind people were taught when they were taught their salesmanship class on how to use guides, especially if you didn't know how to travel with a cane, how to make sure that person did not take away from your image as a quality blind person, and how they used their tools, such as promoting themselves through paper or through word of mouth, the words that would help you make a better salesman. But also, they were told in their salesmanship classes for piano tuning for blind people, you need to be out there in the community. They need to see you. You need to play at the church socials. You need to be out there participating in the community groups so that people know your name, so that you can build up people who are going to talk kindly about you and pass that on.
Educate the public.
Exactly.
Peggy, you've mentioned that some of these stories have been lost in time through history. Can you tell our listeners some of the reasons why these stories have been lost?
I think there's a lot of reasons why that happened. Some of it has to do with, I think, the public's idea of blind people. If they were successful, it must be a fluke, or it must not really be true. On the other hand, you've got blind people who have found a way to use, especially newspapers, to promote themselves by getting stories out there. And they were reprinted over and over again because, wow, this is fantastic. So I kind of think it depended on where you lived, as to whether or not the community promoted you. But also, one of the ways that we leave a history is through our children and grandchildren. A lot of these blind people did not marry or have children. In many communities, it was frowned upon for two blind people to marry. because you would only be continuing your blindness, as they thought most blind children who grew up as adults would pass that on. How could you be parents anyway? But they didn't have the family to tell the stories that we often do and celebrate our lives later on when we get a little older. A lot of us had our heyday in our 20s and 30s, and that time frame then didn't translate to our 60s if we didn't have people to remind others about what we had done in the past. Today we have the internet, and the internet tells you all kinds of stuff and repeats it over and over again, whether it's true or not. Back in those days, you had a lot of word of mouth, not a lot of things were written down, and the memoirs that many of these blind people who were literate left were in Braille. When they passed away, their families or coworkers or neighbors, they couldn't read it, so they threw it out. And so we don't have that left either.
Peggy, I really like the phrase that you use, the traceable blind. What is the traceable blind?
The traceable blind I use because I have thousands of names of blind people. Outside of maybe a reference in a biennial report from a school for the blind, or maybe a birth notice, or an appearance in a family tree, they just fall off the face of the earth. A lot of these blind people never appeared even in census data. Even when I try and massage the names to see if I can't make them come up in some other way, they just fall off the face of the earth.
Just gone forever. Now, Peggy, in reading some of your stories, one of them really stood out to me. Could you tell our listeners about the incarnation of the typewriter?
I find the typewriter fascinating because here's an invention that was developed by a lot of people, but it was a blind man, Pierre Forcel, I think his name was, who actually won a prize in 1850 for developing the typewriter so that blind people could communicate and do business with the sighted world. And there were other blind people that had a lot to do with that as well. It was a fascinating story because up until the 1900s, it was primarily used by blind people to communicate. It was taught in the schools for the blind. Then sighted people got a hold of it. Wow, now our documents can be legible. And sighted people adopted the technology. Now you have specially designed keyboards and programs where you can talk into, because there are so many rehab professionals, educators of blind people, and blind people themselves who believe it is too difficult to learn to type, when it was an invention for blind people in the beginning. So I find that fascinating, that we have even lost the main purpose of why the typewriter was invented.
Now, I understand that there was a love story involved here, too.
That's true as well. There was a count who had a blind wife, and the countess felt that the count was not as attentive as he could be. So she found other sources of stimulation, you might say. Anyway, one of her lovers also worked on a typewriter so that she could type her letters to him. Because what happened is when she had her maids write out the letters for him, of course they went past the count first. And so sometimes her lovers didn't get their letters. You know, necessity is the mother of invention there.
Ah, yes, out of necessity. Speaking of inventions, there was a gentleman from Minnesota you wrote about who invented a window cleaning system.
The window that comes in so that you can clean your windows from the inside.
That's nice.
There was a blind man from Minnesota, actually, who lost not only his eyesight, but part of his hearing in his hand, one of his hands, from a dynamite explosion. He owned a house, and it was 2 stories. He had to climb up on the ladder and change. You know, in Minnesota, you got the storms and the screens. And decided this was kind of difficult for a guy with, only one hand, and thought there had to be a better way. So he designed a window that you pull in from the top down. It's on a hinge, and you can clean it and also bring in the storms and the screens that way from the inside of the house. That was patented in the 1940s and actually made him quite successful financially. Before he invented the window, he was a blind salesman door to door. In the 1930s, he hired a friend who was out of work and had a beat-up old truck. And they would load all these brooms from one of the broom factories where blind people worked, making the brooms. They'd load up the truck, and since the blind salesman pretty much had it sewed up in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, he drove way out of town, even to North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, selling these brooms, and he could sell them in bulk. So during the Depression, that is how he supported his family and actually got his family back. He was a widow. After the explosion, his children were farmed off to other family members because, he needed to recuperate from the explosion, and he needed to learn how to be a blind guy. So for a few years, his children were raised by family members until he could support himself as a broom salesman. So I found his story fascinating as well.
Very fascinating. I mean, whether the story's 80 years old or 150 years old, it's so relevant today. And, these stories, as you said, these lives, these stories would have fallen off the face of the earth, but you go out and find them.
And they're hidden. You can't find it in a book. For example, the gentleman from Minnesota who invented the window. I ran across that in a news article, and of course it may have had his name spelled wrong. I used genealogical tools to research family trees to see if I can find them. I went through files at the Minnesota Historical Society and found in the summer school program that they had for blind men and women back in the 20s and 30s in Minnesota. I found reference to him being there and a photograph. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Because I now have the correct spelling of his name, I could go back and research him a little further. Sometimes it takes me several years to find enough to put together for even 4 or 5 paragraphs of how did these blind people learn their skills? How did they meet up with other blind people, find their jobs, etc.?
Peggy, in reading some of your articles from the Blind History Lady Presents on the web, I noticed that some are just 5,000 words long and others are 20,000 words long.
At smashwords.com, I have published several books. Some are short, some are long. The Blind History Lady Presents. Some of them are quite lengthy because I've been able to find a lot of information about the people that I've been studying. Albert Gonzalez is one of those people that his book is kind of long. He would have told you this if he was alive to tell you, but he was a show-off as a kid and a daredevil, and that is how he went blind. He was showing off, diving off a high board into a pool and hit his head on the bottom of the pool. He eventually, within a short period of time, lost his eyesight. He went to law school because when he went through blind training in Washington, D.C., through the federal government, because his blindness happened while he was in a military camp to recruit young men to military service. He met a blind lawyer, so he thought, well, I can be a blind lawyer. So he went to law school. Nobody would hire him as a blind lawyer, so he opened his own office. He became a state legislator here in the state of New Mexico. And because he was a show-off and because he enjoyed people and getting out there and talking to people, he did a lot of his own PR and left many, many, many news articles about him. Also, 3 of his children are still alive and living here in New Mexico, and were very willing to share stories about their dad and telling how he traveled, how he handled his courtroom duties. Even though he worked hard to promote himself, he found that all the more wealthier citizens of New Mexico were certainly willing to have him in their circle of friends, but not hire him as an attorney. So he worked with a lot of the poor people who didn't always pay in cash. They paid in potatoes or sometimes even a piece of land. Those were the blind people that went to the polls and got him elected onto the school board, got him elected as a judge. He found a constituency that would support him, maybe not financially, but supported him enough to advance his career. He didn't make a lot of money as a lawyer. He made most of his money actually in real estate. And some of that started because of the small little pieces of land that his clients traded for legal services. So he's one of the people that you can read about at Smashwords.
Smashwords.com, because that's where I got your first book on Kindle. But there's other formats they can get your book in, too.
Correct. There are many different ways to download from www.smashwords.com. Some of them are very accessible, some of them are not. And those of you who are familiar with your formats will know which ones they are. There's a text option. As you said, there's a Kindle option. They can also be downloaded from the iTunes store. Smashwords converts my files for iTunes, Barnes & Noble, and many other places as well. So they are in an accessible format.
Peggy, you've really earned that title, the Blind History Lady. I like that because the work that you're doing to bring these stories to light gives us a snippet of time. I mean, some of these articles you've worked on for years just to give us 5,000 words on something that would have been gone from history, and here they are showing people how they used to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
There was no services for the blind. There were no scholarships to go to universities or trade schools for higher education. There was the poor farms. There were county welfare rolls. Many chose not to do that because you went to the city council meeting or the county board meeting and your name was put in the paper. So-and-so is going to receive so much money from our county welfare fund. And your families didn't want you to do that because it was sort of shamed on if you didn't take care of your family members. However, you had to make a living somehow, and what money were available from the counties or the cities was inconsistent. You might get it this month, but you wouldn't get it next month. There wasn't enough money in the fund. So it wasn't something that you could depend on. Going to the poor farms was in many times worse than going to jail because the poor farms, some of them that I have read about, basically they closed the gates on the poor farms at sunset and you were on your own. The cops didn't come in there and deal with it. So if you couldn't defend yourself, blind people had their things stolen from them, what little that they had on a regular basis, were beaten up on a regular basis. That was not a place you wanted to be as a blind person. So out of desperation, you would sometimes try anything than going to the poor farm. Blind people would live together and have their own little broom factory within their house. And you were talking about small houses where 6 or 7 blind people would work together. But by doing so, they could support themselves as a little small co-op, if you will. They would try anything to make a living. And some of them did pretty well.
This stuff is just fascinating. You know, the history, I love history. And other people might have stories, and if they do and want to share them with you, how would they get a hold of you, Peggy?
You can email me at peggychong@earthlink.net. That's all one word, PEGGYCHONG@earthlink.net. And I would be very pleased, even if it's just, a small news article that references a blind person doing something interesting, different. I would be very pleased to have it. I just heard of a blind circus performer. Now, I have not been able to locate the family they talk about, as I'm sure that they were never in the right place at the right time for most census documents, but I'll find them. I think it's very interesting that a blind person is a circus performer.
Oh, yeah. And what you're doing, Peggy, the Blind History Lady, you're preserving history, like your column title, The Way We Were. Now people will be able to read your stories about the way they were.
And I hope that what happens is when a person goes blind and someone says to them, well, a blind person has never been an insurance agent, or a blind person has never owned their own car dealership, that they will be able to easily find on the Blind History Lady material that blind people have done that. There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of insurance men. There have been many blind men who have been editors of newspaper, careers that traditionally one wouldn't think of as a blind career. We as blind people don't know our own history very well at all, and we rely a lot on agency people who don't know our own history either, because it just hasn't been out there for them to know.
Peggy Chong, the Blind History Lady. Thank you so much for coming on to Blind Abilities and sharing your stories, sharing your websites, your resources, and your passion for the genealogists you are. And thanks for what you're doing, because you're preserving a part of history that many of us wouldn't have known, and now they too can go on your websites and download some books and read about what you've been working on.
And hopefully that people will say, you know what, if they can do it, so can I.
Yes, you're inspiring such a great attitude, Peggy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be on your podcast.
It was such a pleasure talking to Peggy Chong, the Blind History Lady, her passion for history and how she shares it. So if you have any stories, articles of people from the past, some history that you want to share, send it on to Peggy Chong, and you can get a hold of her at Peggy Chong at earthlink.net. That's PEGGYCHONG at EARTHLINK.net. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed, and until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see through
each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the realities of blind abilities.
The realities of blind abilities.
For more podcasts with a blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities. Download our app from the App Store, blindabilities, that's 2 words, or send us an email at info@blindabilities.com. Thanks for listening.